Joining us, Your Vote Action Hour. At the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters, we believe that protecting our environment and strengthening our democracy go hand in hand. That's why we're committed to expanding access to the ballot for all people. Climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's a justice issue. Severe weather events made more frequent and intense by climate change can prevent people from reaching the polls. This impact falls hardest on communities of lower socioeconomic status who often have fewer resources to recover from these disruptions. When entire communities are silenced by barriers to voting, our democracy suffers. That's why we're working on democracy initiatives to ensure that every voice is heard, especially those most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Expanding access to the ballot is crucial for a just and resilient future. Together, we can build a democracy that truly represents and protects all people. So today's action hour will focus on the importance of absentee voting access and the significant impact that the absentee voting and ballot referendum can have on our communities. It's an excellent opportunity today to learn about voting logistics and how to empower yourself with the knowledge needed to ensure your voice is heard this election season. So enough with my talking. We have two great speakers today who are going to share really great insights on absentee voting, making a voter plan, etc. So first you will hear from Carol Rizzolo, a statewide leader in voting rights and a returning delegate from the Democratic National Convention, and then you will hear from Gus Marks Hamilton from ACLU of Connecticut Rise PAC. So with all of that said, I am going to hand it over to Carol.
Thank you, Juliana, and thank you to the League of Conservation Voters for hosting me on this. So my name is Carol Rizzolo. I lead Connecticut Shoreline Indivisible, and several years ago was part of a small group who started Safe Vote Connecticut. I also am the Connecticut coordinator for Center for Common Ground and several other voting rights projects. One of the golden threads for me for an entire lifetime, so I'll just say that, is giving voice to people whose voices are historically marginalized. I worked in pediatrics for 25 years as a physician assistant, and then left it to go get a doctorate, worked in hospice for a while. These are the voices, and obviously the voices of voters, who are often marginalized. They're left out. We know that a lot of politicians don't necessarily go to the communities where there isn't a lot of money. And so it's been our job to get to those communities, make it clear that they can vote and why it matters to them to vote. So for those who are just sort of connecting into a lot of this work, about 6 years ago, many of us realized that it was really very difficult to vote in Connecticut. It was difficult to access the ballot, right? I mean, we had the most restrictive ballot access in the country. We were one of only 4 states in the nation, us, Alabama, Mississippi, and New Hampshire, who had no form of early voting, which was outrageous and just a terrible group. Well, I shouldn't say that, but it was just a bad group to be connected with, right, as far as voting rights. And so we worked very hard to pass the early voting ballot referendum. That required 2 different legislative bodies voting in more than 50%. That didn't come out right. Give me a minute. Either we could have gotten it passed in one legislative session with 75% or more supporting it in both of our state houses. We didn't get that. And because we didn't get that, it required 2 separate legislative seated bodies in order to pass it at a simple majority for us to have gotten that early voting ballot referendum onto the ballot in the last set of elections, the last even year election, which is how it is that we now have early voting. The thing is with having early voting is that town to town, many of you may know, we have 169 towns in Connecticut. Each one has a different location for elections. Each one has, as far as the early voting goes. So it's a very complicated way to answer where I am headed with this, and for that, I really do apologize. But we now have the possibility of early voting. Early voting in Connecticut is going to start October 21st, and will proceed most days through the actual election day in November. In order to find out where your early voting locations are, you need to contact your town clerks. To do that, you've really got to spread the word to everyone you know to contact their town clerk. find out where exactly the early voting locations are. So when the pandemic hit, March of 2020, many of us got together and again started the Safe Vote group. Safe Vote group had 34 leaders of groups or nonpartisan leaders from around the state saying, listen, a lot of us were uncomfortable going to the polls during the pandemic. And with the help of federal funding and with the Secretary of State and with the legislature, we were able to get to the point where we could say, okay, we need absentee balloting. We need COVID to be a reason to get an absentee ballot. Many of you may remember, we actually used federal funds. Everybody received the ballot in the mail. Everybody received the application for the absentee ballot at no cost, and return postage was paid for. That is not the case anymore. Those federal funds were used up now, and so everything reverted back. In the state constitution, it says that in order to access an absentee ballot, you must be ill. Let me back that up. In order to access the ballot and get an absentee ballot, the requirements for that were illness, out of town. It was very simple. But 60 years ago, the legislature added into that to say the voter must be ill, or you must be out of town for every minute of the 14 hours of election day. So given that, we had, you had people who lived in Hartford, worked in East Hartford, went to school in West Hartford, and would drive through Hartford for 5 minutes on the highway. That meant they could not legally access an absentee ballot because they were in town for some part of that. With the help of the GAE, with May Flexer, and the help of Matt Blumenthal, we were able to change the language back to the language of the Constitution. It was not voter's illness or every minute of the day. It is back again to illness and just you're out of town that day, making it once again legal, but quite restrictive in order to access an absentee ballot. So for the last 2 legislative cycles, we have again been working with the legislature and calling all of our legislators somewhat relentlessly to say we really need to expand what we do in absentee voting. Any eligible voter needs to be able to access an absentee ballot without fear or favor. We need to be able to do that. There's been a lot of pushback, but it has taken us 2 legislative sessions with over 50%. It will now be on the ballot. The challenge is voters don't know about it, is one. There's quite a bit of pushback from the other side saying fraud, there's going to be fraud, but actually the examples of fraud are very few. It's a very rare thing that somebody is willing to risk a $5,000 felony fine because of casting a ballot that might have been unkosher. So at this point, given, as I just said a moment ago, we have 169 towns, which means we have 169 different ballots, which means this no excuse, well, it's written up there as no excuse. We're trying to change the language away from no excuse to just expanding absentee voting. It may be on the front of your ballot. It may be on the back of your ballot. It may not be the only referendum on your ballot. Some towns may well have a second referendum that's quite local, which has happened to us before as well. So I want to show you, so I'm going to screen share. Wait a second. Let me get to the exact screen share. I want you to see what exactly the language is. What exactly the language is on this, right? At this point, 35 states and DC all allow voters to use absentee ballots. It's time for us to totally join our neighbors. And the referendum question exactly is, shall the Constitution of the state be amended to permit the General Assembly to allow each voter to vote by absentee ballot? In Connecticut, our ballot referenda can only give that responsibility back to the legislature as to exactly what do we mean by expanding absentee voting. It was the same with the early voting. It's the legislature has to make the decision. So once this passes, which it needs to, and we need everybody's help to get it passed, once it's passed, it will now again go back to the legislature and they can say exactly what it will look like to allow every voter to vote by absentee. So if my presentation is a little bit sketchy, I do apologize. I did just come back from being a delegate for the DNC. It was phenomenal and it was exhausting. And so, again, my total apologies for having maybe gone all over the map in that. But it truly, the explanation more than anything is that many of us around the state have worked for 6 years to try to expand absentee voting so that all eligible Connecticut voters will be able to vote regardless of where they are. I will point out that my mother, who at 101 passed away a year ago. If my mother had been ill, I would not have been able to qualify for an absentee ballot for myself to take care of her. Our postal workers in Guilford, one of them lives in New Haven. She's got 3 kids. She has to leave, as you can imagine, she has to leave home early enough, right after she gets her kids off to school. She's got to get to Guilford to work. And then at 5 o'clock, she goes back into New Haven to take care of her kids. And so early voting helped that some, but she's still taking care of 3 children all the time. And so for her and for a lot of our workers and a lot of us, a lot of people who are ill, a lot of us who are caregivers, a lot who are taking care of others, there's a huge population who benefits from being able to cast their ballot by absentee. So if you've got questions, please put them into the chat. Again, I really do apologize for being a bit spazzed about this, but the DNC kind of did that to a lot of us, I think. So thanks for the opportunity, Juliana, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're going to do questions at the end, and we have a few in the chat right now, but I wanted to hand it over to Gus, and then we will get into questions after that. So, Gus, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juliana. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. And thank you, Carol, so much. It's great to be here with folks who care about voting and voting rights. Because I think, as Carol was alluding to, our voting rights are literally on the line this year, and none of us can afford to be on the sidelines. I also have some slides that I'm going to share with folks too in just a second, and hopefully we'll go through them really quickly so we can answer some of the questions as we get towards the end of this thing. But I just wanted to highlight one thing. When Carol was talking about, folks having to need an excuse in order to be able to vote by absentee ballot, no one should need an excuse from their or an explanation to their government to be able to vote. Everybody deserves an opportunity to vote in a way that is convenient and safe for them. And that's one of the lines we've been highlighting as we do door knocking around the state. Since the beginning of August, we've been out in communities. We've been in Hartford, New Britain, Windsor. We're in Meriden right now, knocking on doors, talking to folks about why expanding access to absentee voters is important. And I have not had a single person push back on me when we say that we want as many people to be able to vote in a way that is safe and makes the most sense for them. Everybody gets that. So, we will get into some of the questions at the very end, though, but I just wanted to highlight at the beginning, nobody needs an excuse to be able to vote. Everybody should be able to vote in a way that is safe and convenient for them. So let me bring up my screen here. Let's see. All right. So for folks who aren't familiar with the ACLU, we are the American Civil Liberties Union of Connecticut. We are the Connecticut affiliate, and we work to defend people's civil rights and civil liberties. Let me go into the presentation mode here. The ACLU of Connecticut RISE PAC is a little bit different. It's unique and singular to Connecticut, but will likely be familiar to folks who have already been following our work because we are honing in on issues that have been at the core of the ACLU of Connecticut's legislative and advocacy efforts for years. We are definitely not here to endorse or support any candidate or political party because they already have power and resources and their own agendas. We are here to fight for the real needs of people they are supposed to be serving, particularly around issues relating to voting rights and voting access here in Connecticut. The ACLU of Connecticut RISE PAC launched in 2022, and we worked on that early voting question that Carol was mentioning earlier. There was a ballot question in 2022, and I wanted to bring up too that after the election, 60% of people who voted that year in 2022 voted yes on early voting. That was a higher higher than any candidate who ran for statewide office in 2022. So I think there is clearly an appetite and a realization that we need to be expanding access to voting and voting rights for everyone in Connecticut from the folks who voted in 2022. So we are voting people to vote yes, like Carol mentioned, on the ballot referendum question. Absentee voting ensures that everyone, including communities that have been systemically disenfranchised, have equal access to voting. Restrictions on voting access disproportionately impact people with disabilities, people who are caregivers, people who have multiple jobs or odd hours at their jobs, and deserve to have as much access to voting as anyone else. And one of the important things to have is a voting plan, which includes people making sure that they know the town they are registered to vote in. It includes knowing what the ballot looks like. As Carol was mentioning, sometimes ballot questions will shift around on the ballot based on where folks live. And if you actually go on the Secretary of the State's website, I believe you will, I don't know if it's up there yet, but eventually you'll be able to see a sample ballot for what it looks like in your town. Before you go to vote, so you'll know exactly where the ballot question is, and you know who the candidates are on your ballot as well. Are you planning to vote by absentee ballot if you have that option right now, or are you planning to vote in person? Will you vote early? Again, like Carol said, we have early voting in Connecticut for the first time this year, and for the general election, early voting begins on October 21st. Do you know where you'll be voting? Because polling locations can change. And finally, if you know all that information, can you share your voting plan with your family and your friends and the people in your network so that they can come up with their own voting plan? And that kind of brings me to my final point here, which is a call to action. Because this is an exciting and busy time in Connecticut with the campaign, certainly going on around the country as well. And if folks are interested in volunteering to door knock in their communities or in other locations around the state for absentee voting rights, I'll drop a link in the chat in just a second where folks can volunteer with the ACLU of Connecticut Rise Pack. We have all sorts of literature that we can give to folks. We can give you a t-shirt. We have lawn signs. We have door hangers. And like I said at the beginning, we are out and about right now, knocking on doors and talking to folks about why absentee voting is so important. We have an organizer down in Fairfield County. If people are down in the southwestern part of the state, Erica Ortiz, who is also doing canvassing and door knocking for absentee voting. So if folks want to get in touch with her, let me know, and we'll connect you guys as well. Later today, we're going to be in Meriden. I think Erica is actually going to be in Norwalk this afternoon canvassing. And we're going to be all over the state over the next 10 weeks or so. I think we have 70 days or 69 or 70 days until the election. And finally, I want to thank all the folks that worked on early voting 2 years ago, but the absentee voting right now, like Carol and Safe Votes and the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters, for the great work you're doing for raising awareness and education around voting and absentee voting, and making sure that people have their rights when the election comes up. So thank you so much, and it's great to be here.
Thank you so much. And if you want to put in the chat, maybe your contact information, I will be sending your contact information in the follow-up email if anyone wants to contact you for volunteering or anything like that. So I got some questions in the chat, some sent to me, but let's address the elephant in the room. How do you respond to the actual fraud in the recent Bridgeport primary? We can no longer say there is no danger of fraud. So that's the elephant in the room. Let's address it.
Yeah, let me jump into that because I had a woman in Meriden on Tuesday who asked me about that. She said she was concerned about fraud. She didn't mention Bridgeport, but she just said, that was a concern of hers. And we can have safe and secure elections, and we can make sure that as many people have an opportunity to vote at the same time. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. We can make sure that as many people have the ability to vote, whether it's by absentee voting or in-person voting, whatever makes the most sense to them. And we can make sure that our elections are as secure as possible. Those two things are not separate. We can do them both at the same time. And the woman, she's like, yeah, that makes sense. Well, I'm down with that. And if people have more specific questions about Bridgeport, I'm not an expert in what happened down there. It's frustrating, but I am reassured that folks were caught, and there is a process that is playing out right now to hold people accountable for what happened. So I'm encouraged that that whatever was happening in Bridgeport was caught. And again, we want to make sure that as many people as possible who are eligible to vote have that opportunity to vote. That to me is the most important thing. And we can have secure elections at the same time. They are not separate things.
And I completely want to echo what Gus said. The system worked is why we know what happened in Bridgeport. It's why we caught what happened in Bridgeport and why it could be addressed and dealt with. So I think that in general, I mean, I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but I know that the fraud levels were very, very low in the absentee voting world. In Connecticut, historically, they have been under 1%. I'm pretty sure that's an accurate number, and I can certainly get that number back to you. But they've looked at it year over year. The reality is that system worked. The system worked. So Gus said it much better than I just did, but at the end of the day, those folks were caught, it's being addressed, and it's being dealt with.
Yes. I have another chat, which I think is probably tailored to me, even though I'm not a speaker, but I did want to just note that, like both of you said, the system caught the bad guys. The bad guys are being held accountable, and so the system works. You can have absentee voting, and you can still have a system that will tailor to all people and catch bad actors. And so it worked. We just want to say that voting by absentee is safe and secure in Connecticut, and don't be afraid or intimidated by the process, because everyone should be able to use it. And so this next question is about environmental sustainability and environmental justice, which Carol and Gus feel free to hop into. But the question was, what role does voting play in advancing social and environmental sustainability? And I know I talked a little bit in the beginning about why we at Connecticut League of Conservation Voters are doing democracy work, and that is because environmental issues being voted on in the legislature come down to who is being put in that seat in the legislature. And so it's really important to vote for environmentally strong lawmakers to be able to make good environmental decisions as well. And like I said, even in Connecticut just recently, there was wildfire smoke this month. There was the historic amount of rainfall and flooding that was happening in Connecticut. And imagine if that was happening on election day. People would not be able to get to the polls, and then they wouldn't be able to make their voices heard. And so that's why it's important for us as the League of Conservation Voters to advocate for expanding access to the ballot for everybody and relating it to climate change and how climate change impacts people getting to the polls. So I hope that answered your question. Now, Carol and Gus, do you have any comments on social justice and why it's important for voting at all?
Again, two things I want to say. Carol mentioned this earlier. Over half of states in this country already allow absentee voting in ways that Connecticut does not. So it's not like we would become an outlier with absentee voting. And the question on the ballot also does not. It says what it says is that the Connecticut legislature will have to come up with a system for absentee voting. It is not automatically making it happen. So I think it's important for people when you have conversations with folks to know that it's not like there's a light switch being flipped. There's still a process that will have to play out in the legislature. And if unfortunately, if something happens where this ballot question does not get passed, we are looking at 4 or 5 more years in the future before we would be able to probably, not entirely unlikely, but most likely we would not be able to address this until 2028, 2029. And there's been a lot of work that's already happened to be able to put the question on the ballot this year. And then lastly, just on a personal level, I have two younger sisters who are both work in public education. One has 3 children, the other has 2 children, all under the age of 6, who are in kindergarten and preschool for the first time. Their lives are wild, just in terms of like all the things that are going on with childcare and their full-time jobs. And the idea that they would be able to vote by absentee ballot gives them so much more flexibility in order to be able to still vote, because clearly voting is very important to them, without having to necessarily go to a polling location, wait in line, and going through all that. As opposed to simply being able to fill out an absentee ballot and drop it off at the town clerk's office or put it in a ballot box. It makes so much more sense for folks, for people who have busy lives. So, just throwing that out there as well.
I also want to say that, different towns will have these different referenda, and this one too, and they're candidates that a lot of voters may never have heard of. So getting an absentee ballot at home, being able to sit at your table and look up who are these candidates and actually thoughtfully go through the questions, thoughtfully have conversations about the questions, about the candidates, explore the candidates. It's just a much less stressful process. And people are much better about understanding who are they voting for, what are they voting for, as compared to, oh my God, I've only got 5 minutes, as Gus was saying about his sisters who were saying, oh my God, the kids are running around. I've got to deal with this and I've got to do it right now. Or as I was mentioning earlier with my mom who's sick, it's like, how do I get there? How do I get back? I've got to do it in such and such time. So I think part of it is you're saving that people aren't driving to and from the polls. They're not having to wait. We know that in certain demographics, a couple of years ago, the people down in New Haven were waiting 3 hours to cast a vote. Now, I'm going to go back, Gus, I'm going to use your kid sisters again, because people with little children, that just throws everything off and they can't necessarily do it. And so they just walk away discouraged. So students, think about yourself when you were a student. Students, people with little kids, people with a job that's in a different town. Because we don't have countywide voting in Connecticut, people have to go back to their town where they live in order to cast their ballot. That can be really problematic. If somebody is actually gone, unexpectedly out of town, and they're going to be unexpectedly out of town for a few days, they've got to be able to access emergency absentee ballots. And as Gus said, without having to explain to the government why they are somewhere else. So I think there are a lot of reasons that a lot of us would consider if you think about who are the people who support our economy. Who are the level of folks who really keep things going? Think about the nurses. I was a PA for 25 years. I mean, I worked 12-hour shifts, 24-hour shifts. Voting was not a priority for me. What government did was a priority, but it wasn't that I was going to walk away from the bedside of a dying patient because, oh shit, I didn't qualify for an absentee ballot and I can't early vote and I can't get back to my town because I worked an hour away in some hospital, an hour away, and I'd have to go back and come back. So it's just one more perspective on why do people need to be able to vote from where they are and do it easily and take their time to look and see what the perspectives and the positions are of the candidates.
Great. We have 2 questions right now, but this first one is, please discuss these 2 criticisms about absentee voting. 1, what prevents someone from voting twice, once by absentee and then at the polls? 2, what if I vote by absentee ballot and then decide I want to change my vote on election day?
Okay, so I'll take that one to start. When you go to vote, like historically in Connecticut, you go to vote, they've got this book and they've got a book there that's got, where they check off your name. And next to your name, there is a letter that says A, and now it also says E. Did you already vote by absentee? Did you already vote early? So the Connecticut system is already in place. We've been using absentee ballots for years. So the same rules that have prevented it historically, prevent it now. And it's the voter rolls. I mean, you read the piece of paper that the people are checking off when you first get your ballot, when you walk in to receive a ballot at the location, it's already there. It's designated. Did you already vote absentee? One of the things that delayed it a little bit for the early voting, once early voting passed, is how did is getting the computer system to be able to put an E next to your name, right? So that it was designated that you voted early. So, I mean, that's something that Connecticut's been dealing with for years and quite successfully. And I'm sorry, the second question, Juliana, the second part of that? You're muted. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. What if I vote by absentee ballot and then decide I want to change my vote on election day?
Yeah, I mean, that actually is sort of it's an ongoing question. Some of you may have been aware of Greg Gianforte, the guy who ran for governor out west, who the day before election day chest bumped a reporter and knocked him to the ground. And people say, oh my God, I already voted. And now I want to change my vote. At this point, nationally, it's been dealt with in so many other states. And the reality is, if you have any question about which candidate you think you're going to vote for, wait and vote on election day. Nothing stops you from voting on election day if you've got any questions like that. If you even have a hint, a whiff of confusion about who you're going to vote for, how you're going to vote, wait and vote on election day. All this does is expand the options for people, as I said, and as Gus has said too, Juliana said also, it just expands the options for those of us. There are many of us who don't necessarily have a lot of question about who am I going to vote for today, tomorrow, or in November. And also, again, the same answer. I mean, I think it addresses that question because you can always vote on election day. Nothing stops you from voting exactly as you have your entire voting life. Gus?
I have one thing I wanted to add. You know, we hear a common complaint that we don't have enough people voting in our elections, and holding the people that we put into power accountable. Because we don't simply, the percentages at every election, we saw this in the primaries at the beginning of August, where we just, you know, we get a really low turnout sometimes, and that's incredibly frustrating. In 2020, though, when everybody in Connecticut had the opportunity to vote by absentee ballot, we saw the highest voter turnout in the history of the state. I think almost close to 80% of registered voters voted in that election. So when people have the opportunity to vote, they will vote. And that's what we want to happen. We want every eligible voter to be able to have that opportunity. And absentee voting is another way for us to get there.
And I just want to highlight Tisha Rossi, who's the co-president of the League of Women Voters in Connecticut, also just posted in the chat. If you change your mind, you can go to the clerk's office, pull your already submitted ballot, and fill out a new one. That is the law in Connecticut. Thank you, Tisha, for putting that up there.
Great. Thank you both so much for that. I have one other question. So please put more questions in the chat. We have until 1. So add any questions you want. So this next question is, why do we need both early voting and absentee voting? What is the difference between them?
One is you've got to have a car that works, right? I mean, early voting, you have to show up somewhere and you have to have a vehicle, right? So that's one really significant one. One is you've got to have the ability to travel. The disability community, for example, is very supportive. They were very supportive of the early voting. They're very supportive of expanding absentee voting. The same with AARP, right? I mean, I don't mean to keep harping on my mother, but at the end of the day, there was no way my mother would have been able to get to the polls. She didn't have a car anymore. She didn't have a driver's license. A lot of her friends, I wish they didn't have driver's licenses or cars anymore, and so do you, right? So, I mean, at this point, the answer really is some people who are able-bodied enough. I know that's sort of a phrase that's a potentially challenged phrase, but people who can actually get in a vehicle and go somewhere, or know someone who goes somewhere. And then when they arrive, they need to be able to get into the voting location. No steps, no challenges, no anything. They just need to get there. When it was just on election day, schools tend to be accessible. But now we've got towns, as I said, 169 different towns where these voting locations are going to be all over the place for early voting. They are not all accessible. And it's a problem. So if the choice is, and so that's one point, is about accessibility. The other is the same. I mean, if I have a choice to sit with my elderly friends and they can fill something out where they are and put it in their own mailbox, that is dramatically easier. I mean, I think about how many people use Instacart, right? Or, I mean, how many people that we all may know, many of these folks who call and have groceries delivered. Why? Why do they do that? Why do they spend the extra money to have that? Well, some folks just cannot get out and navigate all of the walking it takes around a grocery store. Or they don't have the vehicle. There are a million reasons why. So I think that it's for folks otherly able, I mean, any number of folks. It's not a zero-sum game of, well, I could just go there. If everybody could just go to the grocery store, Instacart would not be a booming business. And if everyone could go to the store, Amazon wouldn't have taken over either. So that's kind of my response, is if mail order stuff is so successful, this is the same. Anyway, sorry to go off, and it's like, Gus, say something clever and I'll stop.
No, that was well said, Carol.
Great.
Thank you.
And I just want to note that it's in-person early voting. You can vote absentee at home. You can fill out an absentee ballot sitting at your desk, and a lot of people feel rushed when they go to the polls in person. And if you are voting absentee at home, you can look up the ballot questions and understand what the question is, and be able to do your research before submitting your ballot. And I think that's another pro of voting by absentee. So we do not have any other questions. So I guess we can wrap up.
There actually is one that Rachel has sent to me directly that I think others may have the same question as well.
Go ahead.
So Rachel, if you don't mind, I am going to read this. I'm just going to read what you've written. I'm concerned now because we've distributed dates and times according to Secretary of State's official info online, which says hours and dates for early voting, October 21st to November 3rd, and the expanded hours, the 29th and 31st. I will just tell you, I have no insider information. Excuse me, I have no inside information about any of this, but I will tell you the town clerks are the ones who actually have all of the information about where to vote, when to vote. And I read what you said, that you printed out a lot of handouts with Secretary of State's dates on them. I have no reason to question what Secretary Thomas and her staff have put out. That said, the website that one goes to for the Secretary of State is very complicated. So for people who are new voters or who are not tech savvy, going to that website to try to find any information is much more complicated than just please call your town clerk. And I put the link in the chat to find your town clerk's information and get exactly the locations and times. Are you also seeing Merla? Oh, here, that was Merla's question, Juliana, you already answered.
Yes. I put in the chat vote 411 / Connecticut. So that's all of Connecticut's voting information for you all if you want to take that link. And we'll also put all of these links into the follow-up email and the recording of the action hour to be sent to you later on today or tomorrow. But Gus or Carol, do you have any last words before we wrap up, or any other questions that you got personally?
Vote yes in November.
Vote yes, absolutely. And there you are. I don't know if you can see it. It's one of my favorite signs. Voting prevents unwanted presidencies. And Gus is holding up his vote yes, absolutely. Please let everyone you know where to find that referendum on their ballot, and be sure to vote yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for your insights during today's action hour. I really appreciate it. And I hope this was helpful for everyone who joined today. And again, this is recorded, so there will be a recording sent to you later and put on our YouTube. So if you want to send this to your friends to make sure they get out to vote, please do that. But again, thank you all so much. I'm going to end now and stop recording. Hope you have a great rest of your week.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, Juliana. Thanks.